the lighting a bit. Nope. Nope. Maybe my seating position needs to change. Maybe that'll make it look better. I don't know. Sure, I'll go with this. Okay. I must have closed that window. Okay. Starting late enough as it is, so we're gonna get started here. Just fix this a little bit. Okay. Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Kings, and today we are going to start with the beginning of 2 Kings. But before I give the whole preamble about that, and of course recapping from last time, I'm just going to encourage you guys to grab your Bibles. If you have a paper copy, or you can use one on the internet, because BibleGateway.com exists. The Bible app is easy to download, stuff like that. Have a Bible on hand and read along with me. I will be using the New International Version. Sorry, just a little itch in my eye there. I'll be using the New International Version. I'll be reading from chapter 1 of 2 Kings, and I'll try and keep it relatively light, but then again, you saw what happened last week, right? That didn't happen, right? I still ended up going like over 2 hours on like 3 chapters. So we'll see how well it goes with reading 4 chapters of 2 Kings. But with that said, though, this is gonna I'm gonna start us off with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive right into the beginning of 2 Kings. So let's just pray quickly. I'll just start us off. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this day. And we thank you for the opportunity to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, that you would teach us something and enlighten us and inspire us on the importance of knowing who you are. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. So just a little preamble, a little bit of a preface, if you will, for 2 Kings. So basically, the big thing about 2 Kings that differentiates it from 1 Kings, but once again, as I've said multiple times, you just treat the 2 King books as one book, really. They are fundamentally one book. Their central focus is the same thing. And that's basically the chronology of from Solomon to the fall of Israel and Judah. to the Babylonians. Which in fact does happen at two different times, because the southern kingdom of Judah does hold out a little bit longer. But basically, they both fall. And while there's a lot of reasons of how that came about, how Israel and Judah fell, but of course the main reason the Bible gets at is the disloyalty and unfaithfulness of Israel and Judah to God, right? And that's ultimately what led them to fall, right? And I mean, yeah, the Bible would treat that as the ultimate reason, and I can see why I would say that. And of course, we can also factor in the other things that obviously played a role, right? But at the same time, the Bible's logic would be those other factors were the byproduct, or not the byproduct necessarily, but the natural consequences and the natural um, eventualities of what happens when you have disloyalty and unfaithfulness to God, if that makes sense. So some of those things would be like, okay, there was really poor organization in the land of Israel. That's why they fell so quickly in comparison to Judah. And a lot of people, if you were just to study from a historian perspective, you would say like, yeah, it was like a mass amount of disorganization in the land of Israel. Well, the Bible would argue then that like, well, that was a natural result of what happens when the people were no longer united because they no longer worship God, because everybody was too busy worshiping idols and doing all sorts of detestable practices that came in direct contradictions, not just to what God wanted for Israel, but within like their different religions to each other. And so when you have that, and this is another reason why like, okay, ethical monotheism, is a thing, right? And why the Bible, really enforces that idea is because, well, when you have polytheism and you have different philosophies based on that, well, they're naturally going to contradict each other. And then that causes a lot of infighting. And that's obviously what happened with Israel, right? So on the surface, that would be the main reason, right? There was a lot of disorganization. But the Bible would say, well, that was a natural part of their polytheistic worldview. And by straying away from God and pursuing other gods, that naturally led to them having these philosophical infighting that eventually, separated the people, and they were no longer united people, making them easy to conquer. But of course, going back to what the Bible is saying about what happened with Israel and Judah, and the Bible follows this time period of about 100 years, a little more than that, of just Israel having, bad king after bad king. Judah has a couple good kings, but most of them are pretty bad. And basically, because of all these crappy kings that come along, Israel and Judah become disunified. You know, they become pretty vulnerable to outside attacks. And surprise, surprise, one comes along and easily conquers both of them, right? So, excuse me. That's fundamentally what happens in the book of Second Kings, right? First Kings as well, but First Kings gets just kind of like has the build up, and then Second Kings you kind of see like the real descent of like Israel and Judah, and they are no longer the superpower that they were when Solomon was king. They're no longer that power. They're quite far from it, and that's why they're easily conquered by the end of Second Kings. But of course, that will be in a few weeks' time when we actually cover that material. But the immediate context as we go from chapters 1 to 4, we're basically just seeing like some kind of some of the more king lineage, this king showed up, that king showed up, and of course some of the one king in particular, Ahab, has interactions with various prophets. Now I didn't mention this last time, which I should have, and why there were these other prophets as opposed to Elijah, who was the first guy that really stand up to Ahab. But you have to remember that Elijah was still in his like kind of depression state, and he was kind of terrified of Jezebel, right? Because she did give him that whole death threat and everything, and just because you're a powerful prophet with God right behind you, you should still take death threats pretty seriously. And Elijah does just that. So God uses other prophets. There's like an unnamed one, just called the Man of God. And then there was also another prophet named Micaiah, right? So we got introduced to them for a little bit, but they only show up here and there because Elijah's not around. Of course, Elijah does return, and I totally gave the wrong voice. I'll go back to the voice I gave him, like, earlier in the streams, and I'll give Elisha the fun voice. But basically, as Second Kings comes around, though, Ahab is dead now, right? Because he went to battle when Micaiah prophesied that, like, oh, you're gonna die from this battle if you go. You probably shouldn't go. And Ahab's just like, screw this guy. I don't want to listen to this prophet. So Ahab locks up Micaiah, and then he goes to battle, and surprise, surprise, he dies. So just like Micaiah said he would. So I mean, the joke's on him, I guess. But basically, that is what happened where we left off. And so now that Ahab is dead, you can tell that Elijah will probably show up on the scene again. Although, albeit quite briefly. But now that Ahab is dead, he will show up just briefly here. And that's where we begin in 2 Kings chapter 1. So after Ahab's death, Moab rebelled against Israel. Now Ahaziah had fallen through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and injured himself. So he sent messengers, saying to them, "Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury." But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, "Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and ask them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, this is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed you are lying on, for you will certainly die." Wow, I can't believe I totally skipped it. Let's do that again. I gotta do the voice this time. Okay, I screwed up last time. I gotta do the voice this time. So let's backtrack a bit. So this is verse 3. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, "Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them, is it because there's no God in Israel that you're going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, this is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed you are lying on, for you will certainly die." So Elijah went. When the messengers returned to the king, he asked them, "Why have you come back?" "A man came to meet us," they replied. "And he said to us, 'Go back to the king who sent you and tell him, this is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die.'" And the king asked them, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you and told you this?" And they replied, "He had a garment of hair and a leather belt around his waist." And the king said, "That was Elijah the Tishbite." I'm just going to close this doorway over here. Then he sent to Elijah a captain with his company of 50 men. It's a lot of guys just to find one guy. The captain went up to Elijah, who was sitting on top of the hill, and said to him, "Man of God, the king says, come down." So Elijah answered the captain, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then fire fell from heaven and consumed the captain and his men. At this, the king sent to Elijah another captain and his 50 men. And the captain said to him, "Man of God, this is what the king says. Come down at once." "If I am a man of God," Elijah replied, "may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then the fire of God fell from heaven and consumed him and his 50 men. Kind of seeing a pattern here. So the king sent a third captain with his 50 men. And the third captain went up and fell on his knees before Elijah. "Man of God," he begged, "please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants. See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and all their men. But now have respect for my life." The angel of the Lord said to Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." So Elijah got up and went down with him to the king. And so Elijah told the king, "This is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? But because you have done this, you will never leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die." You will certainly die. Wow, I can't speak. So then, the king died, according to the word of the Lord that Elijah had spoken. But because Ahaziah had no son, Joram succeeded him as king in the 2nd year of Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. As for all the other events of Ahaziah's reign and what he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? So that was chapter 1. Pretty brief series of events. So basically, Ahab was dead, and then Ahaziah succeeded him for like a couple of years. And Ahaziah, I guess he slips and falls pretty bad, and then he's like wounded, and then he tries to see if he's going to recover, and so he tries to have his messengers seek out other gods to get an oracle or whatever, right? Some kind of soothsayer or something. But Elijah's kind of points out to these guys like, is there no God in Israel that you can go to? You go seek out other gods. But of course, Ahaziah knows, and he probably like has awareness of like how unfavorable he is in the eyes of God, like in contrast to like his predecessor, Ahab, right? Where Ahab, when he was obligated to seek the counsel of God by Jehoshaphat, Ahab was pointed out that like, well, you're going to meet a terrible fate. That's what God says. And so Ahaziah probably thought the same thing. And, yeah, he's correct, because maybe if you did things, obeyed God and followed his statutes, Ahaziah, you wouldn't be in this situation. And I mean, that's the other thing too that the Bible gets at, where it's like, well, what is the point of like seeking other gods when they're not gods, right? Only the Lord is God. And so you're basically just wasting your time. And so that's where Elijah comes into the picture. And he's just like, yo, guys, you just waste your time, right? Like, why bother? Ahaziah is as good as dead. Now, a couple things to point out. First is, Elijah's back on the scene. And, he's been gone for a while, right? Because Ahab had probably been king for a number of years before he died. After the whole, Elijah story a couple weeks ago that we read, where Elijah was chased out. And I just mention it now because it's not like it's a big mystery, and the next chapter will reveal it anyway. But Elijah was basically away training up Elisha. And I'll point this out now, but I'll definitely mention it again when we read the next chapter, because, I mean, it just shows up in the next chapter. Where basically Elijah, all this time, he was away training up Elisha to be his successor. And so that's why we haven't seen him for a little while. And even though like in the Bible, by Bible chapters, it's only been like what, like 8 chapters? No, less than like 8 chapters that I read or whatever. Actually, it's not that many. How many did I read? Like I read 3 last week, and then like a couple chapters before that was the whole Elijah story, right? So like 5 chapters. But even though it's like 5 chapters that we've been reading through, a lot of time has passed, right? And so, and Elijah's been gone, for most of it because he's been running from Jezebel, one, and two, he's more importantly raising up Elisha to take his place when he leaves. Because as we'll see in chapter 2, Elijah does leave the world. Basically, he doesn't die, but he like gets magically whisked away, which will be a fun story in its own right that we're going to read pretty soon. Another thing that's kind of like a fun trivia thing. There's a name in here that shows up. One of the god of the Ekronites, whatever they're called, the people of Ekron. They have a god named Baal-zebub, and yes, if you haven't caught it already, that is actually the name of which the famous, name in like Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub, shows up. If you ever read, Lord of the Flies, or you've played any gothic horror games like Castlevania, and I might as well just kind of point this out. There was that one boss in Castlevania, the Beelzebub boss, and that dude was just so freaky when I was a kid because it's like a giant corpse monster with like bees all over him, right? And of course when the name Beelzebub was translated into Greek into the Septuagint, and then later got kind of what's that word I'm thinking of? It's like it's what happens. I'm trying to think of like what happens when like okay, let's say you have a word that exists in a certain language and time period, and then later in time, and as different languages try to use this word, it gets changed in what it sounds like and what it means, and so Baal-zebub, the original name of this god of the Ekrons, was later then translated and then read as Beelzebub. And then, of course, the modern reading of it as Beelzebub would mean like Lord of the Flies, right? And so, which I'm pretty sure if you read the Hebrew, that is not at all what the name suggests at all, right? Because Baal was kind of like the way that he would be defined, his name, Baal, would be like the time. So in a way, you could define Baal as like the god of the age, of this time, kind of thing. And I remember when I was in youth group, the best way of understanding that he was kind of the god of the trends, right? So Baal exists in a sense, in YouTube, he exists because he is the god of the things that are trending, and then of course you have stuff like TikTok and all those things, right? Baal exists in those things because he is the god of the trend, or what is quote unquote cool, right? That's kind of how you should actually interpret that. How you go from like god of trends to god of bees is like a very strange thing that like who knows how the Hebrews came up with this logic throughout but in this time period in the Book of Kings we're like 700 BC, something like that. And so, well, 800, we're probably not quite 800 BC. We're probably a little bit later than that because the Babylonian conquest is like 7 something BC. I should actually look up exactly the date. It's like 700 something BC, where the Babylonians actually, conquer Israel. But it's, we're moving toward the later part, right? So we're probably not 800 BC anymore. We're probably a little bit past that. So we're not in the 9th century BC, we're in the 8th century BC for sure. And so by the time the name Beelzebub is used, it's much later, right? Once again, the Septuagint is a big factor. Septuagint wasn't around till like 300 BC. So, that's 500, that's like 500 years there already. And then, of course, by the New Testament, where the name Beelzebub first appears in the Bible, though it has obviously had appeared in other places before that, that's another 300 years after the Septuagint. So, 800 years for a name to get, like, changed, if you will. Obviously, some context and understanding of it will be lost. Will be lost in that time period, which is just natural when it's like 800 years old, right? I mean, you can think of that in the English language, right? Where chamber and bedroom, right? So before Shakespeare, people would address. Well, I mean, English wasn't even a real, like, it was a very different language then. Before Shakespeare was a thing, right? Shakespeare's relatively pretty recent. He's only like before 1600s, right? So 400 years, the English language has changed so much. And so, for one example, is that Shakespeare, quote unquote, invented the room bedroom. He invented the word bedroom, because before that, no one ever called it the bedroom. It was called the chamber. And so, how we get those two different words to essentially mean the same thing, and how Shakespeare decided to use completely different letters and a different set of words, right, to convey this idea of, like, the place where you sleep, right? Your private quarters, if you will. Who knows the thought process exactly how Shakespeare got there, right? And I mean, that's only, the word bedroom has only been around for 400 years, and that obviously has changed from that too, right? And so, it's interesting how languages evolve like that. And so, we read in Kings, there's this character, this figure, apparently, the god of the Ekrons, Baalzebub, which, yes, is actually the name that Beelzebub comes from. As a matter of fact, they may as well be the same character, right? The same word, essentially, right? But it's kind of funny where if you read the modern version, the Beelzebub, it means something very different from the Baalzebub, of which is used in the Book of Kings, even though, yeah, they're essentially the same name. I don't know, I just thought it'd be interesting to point that out, because it's weird that words do that, right? I mean, that's how names change over long periods of time and culture, of course. I mean, the Babylonian conquest, which we will obviously talk about in more detail later, obviously did have a big influence on how the Hebrews approach language. And that's another problem with the Bible in general. And you don't notice it as much in the nuances when you read a translation like we're reading right now. We're reading like an English translation, right? But if you read like the older text, and like you read, the Old Testament in Hebrew, and then you try to read like the New Testament in a Hebrew translation, because the New Testament was originally written in like something called Koine Greek or Common Greek at the time, which is totally different from modern Greek. I'll tell you a funny story though. Like after I had finished studying Greek in seminary for like 2 years, I'm like, yo, I'm gonna try reading modern Greek. I had no idea how stupid I looked, because, well, Greek changed quite a bit for like 2,000 years, right? But me and my ignorance and arrogance was like, oh yeah, I got the basics of Koine Greek. I think I can figure out modern Greek. I was wrong. I was dead wrong. Because languages change and evolve, right? I mean, that's part of the beauty of languages, is that they do that, right? Because languages are not this stagnant thing. They're constantly evolving. And that's the beauty of learning languages as well. But that's its own topic altogether. But the name inspiration is obviously there, right? With Baalzebub and Beelzebub. So if you were wondering, when you read 2 Kings chapter 1, you're wondering like, oh, Baalzebub, that name sounds very familiar. Because it's the exact same name. It's the exact same name, right? So, coincidence? Not at all. Anything else really to say? Not really. Elijah's back on the scene. Of course he would be with that Ahab is dead, even though it's technically Jezebel he's running away from. But we'll see what happens with her too at some point, because yeah, Jezebel is still around, even though Ahab is gone. Anyway, that's enough of chapter 1. Just eat this pineapple here. Then we'll move on to chapter 2. Okay, chapter 2. So when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, interesting, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Now Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha, and asked, "Do you know what the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes and no," Elisha replied, "so be quiet." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." Elisha replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. And the company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes and no," he replied, "so be quiet." Then Elijah said to him, "Man, you get these guys' names confused. I can't believe I get them mixed up all the time like this." Then Elijah said to Elisha, verse 6, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." Elisha replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. Now 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Now Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. And the water divided to the right and to the left. And the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I am taken from you." "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." So as they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took his garment and tore it in two. Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. I did the wrong voice for a second there. When Elisha struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. Now the company of prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. "Look," they said, "we are your servants, and we have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and sent him down on some mountain or in some valley." "No," Elisha replied. "Do not send them." But they persisted until it was too embarrassing to refuse. So Elisha said, "Send him." And they sent 50, who searched for 3 days, but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?" Verse 19. The people of the city said to Elisha, "Look, our lord, this town is well situated, as you can see, but the water is bad, and the land is unproductive." "Bring me a new bowl," Elisha said, "and put salt in it." So they brought it to him. Then Elisha went out to the spring and threw the salt into it, saying, "This is what the Lord says. I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive. And the water has remained pure to this day, according to the word Elisha has spoken." From there Elisha went up to Bethel, as he was walking along the road. Now some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. "Get out of here, Baldy," they said. "Get out of here, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. And he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there returned to Samaria. Okay, so chapter 2. The major thing from this chapter just is the idea that basically Elijah has basically been taken to heaven, apparently. He's taken away, and his protege, Elisha, and yes, that does get confusing because their names are only really different by one letter. And the way you can tell is that J goes before S. That's kind of the easy way to remember who came first. So basically, Elijah's taken away, and then Elisha asks Elijah a request of like, "Oh, I want a double portion of the Spirit put upon you." And so Elijah tells him, "Yeah, that if you wash me as I leave, then that will be granted to you. If not, then too bad." And of course, there's that part where Elisha just kind of points out what he sees, and that's kind of like the way to prove that he did see what happened, because he saw, well, the fiery chariot and the horses. A bizarre scene of itself, right? A chariot of fire, and then like, what does it do? Like a crazy tornado thing? After all, it said he disappeared in a hurricane. Now I know hurricanes and tornadoes aren't the same thing, but you get the idea, right? He's just carried off into the winds, right? And Elijah just disappears, basically. Goes beyond the human eye can see. And of course, this is where Elisha's like, he's got the power, right? I guess you could say. And there's an interesting thing that happens here, where Elisha rips up his own cloak, probably leaves it there, because the Bible never says that he takes it back up or anything. He just rips his cloak. And then he takes the one that belonged to Elijah. And of course, it's kind of like a rite of passage, motif going on here, right? That Elisha is no longer the apprentice. He is now the master, right? The mentor, apprentice motif. He's no longer the apprentice. He is now the master. And so the ripping of his own cloak and then taking Elijah's is kind of, that old-fashioned, trope of becoming the master. So now he walks around in the master's clothes, and he is now recognized, right, as the master, which we quickly see. We quickly see with the prophets that were at Jericho, right? They see Elisha and how he's wearing Elijah's robe and whatever, and they're like, we see you, and we recognize you as the great prophet of Israel and all that, right? Now, of course, there's the last part of the chapter. Just kind of going to skim through this pretty quickly because there's really not much else to really talk about the whole succession thing with Elijah and Elisha, right? I mean, what else is there to say, right? Elijah did his set of miracles and has moved on, and then Elisha has now, taken on the mantle. Really, not much else to say about that. But the interesting part is the two little short miracle stories that happens. So the first one is where Elisha heals water. As weird as that sounds, right? He heals water. And the second one is, I guess he summons bears to kill some, children, which makes, I know a lot of people be like, doesn't that make him a terrible guy? Why would he send animals to go kill some kids? He's a child murderer. But we'll get to that in a bit. So the first one is the healing of water, as weird as that sounds. Yes, every time I say it out loud, it just sounds bizarre, doesn't it? But anyway, so basically he's in this place and the water's bad. And of course, if the water's bad, that means everybody else is going to die, right? Because that means you can't grow crops. You probably couldn't drink the water, let alone grow crops, let alone, excuse me, first you onto the stream. Let alone a whole bunch of other things, right? If the water isn't good. And so, these people are kind of like, they need help, right? They need help. And so Elisha does just that, right? He gets salt of all things and throws some into the water, and then it restores the water, right? And of course, the narrator has to tell, and we still use this water to this day, the water has in fact been purified. And so, I mean, there's two layers of this, right? On the one hand, there's the whole okay, this kind of fable element of okay, where did this great pond or stream or whatever, this body of water, I assume it's an oasis or whatever, right? So where did this water come from and why is it so amazing and so important and vital to our lives? And it's well, it wasn't always that way, was probably what the story would go down as, right? And okay, and this water used to actually be really bitter and it was bad and the land was dying, but Elisha the prophet, he threw salt in it and it restored the water, and the water's been good ever since, and we're grateful for that and all that, right? That's one way that the story can be presented, right? Kind of like that kind of fable, and just telling that oh yeah, where this pond came from. And of course, it's not on another hand sort of thing, but it's more the two sides of the same coin, where it's this validates, I guess you could say, Elisha being a prophet of God and that he's going to do great things, right? And he's already done a great thing apparently by making this, water clean. And now because of his actions, tons of people will live. And so there's that aspect to, seeing this miracle and why this miracle is so important. Now you could argue that the whole splitting the Jordan River thing is the first miracle, which I guess it is. And we don't know if Elisha's done any before succeeding Elijah. But since, succeeding Elijah, the splitting of the Jordan would be the first one. And then this healing of the water is the second one. And of course, it's interesting that it's water related miracles. And of course, I already talked about the significance when we talk about water within not just the Bible, but in mythology in general, right? Where water is, it's chaos because it has no real form. I mean, the whole Bruce Lee thing about the thing about water is that it takes on the properties of which it is in, right? So when you have water in a teapot, the water becomes the teapot, right? that whole philosophy. So that there's obviously some truth in that. And so that's one when they talk about like miracles in water, related miracles, there's that whole chaos element of like, okay, water's kind of formless, but it takes shape on whatever, you know, is contained in it, whatever. And of course, within that chaos, though, there is life, right? Of course, water is essentially, the source of life on Earth, right? I mean, next to the sun, obviously, but the water is essentially one of the most, essential parts of life. And so, doing miracles in relation to water is about like control over life, in a sense, right? Not to say that Elisha himself does it. It's obviously the power of God through Elisha. But at the same time, Elisha has access to that power, if that makes sense. Elisha has access to, God's power over life in a weird sense, right? And that's how you should read the water miracles, right? Anytime a water miracle occurs, is that like, well, now we share with God, power over life. But of course, there's a flip side, right? And if you guys were here on Monday and watching that Monday stream, the Streaming Parson podcast, which you definitely check out, Mondays at 4 o'clock. But you remember Monday's podcast, I talked about one of my favorite hot takes when we read the Bible in general is that one thing that we should ultimately remember, which I know can be a little troubling at times, is that despite all the evil forces that are out there, right, in actuality, I mean, all those things pale in comparison to what it means to really revere and even fear God. Is that, well, if God is ultimately the source of life, he is also ultimately the taker of life, right? And so, a little fun thing I would do, and honestly, it's not even like a hot take if you just read the Bible. More honestly, it's not really that much of a hot take if you think about it. But of course, with a lot of modern Christians, they would treat it like a hot take because there is a scary part to accepting, the Bible this way. And that is, since God is the giver of life, he's ultimately the taker of life. And I made the parallel of like the Grim Reaper kind of side of God, right? And in a sense, since think of it like this, if God is ultimately the source of life, he is also the giver and taker of life, right? Which the book of Job completely acknowledges, right? He giveth and taketh away. God is ultimately the giver of life. He is also ultimately can be the taker of life, which by extension of that definition is then essentially, the bringer of death, as weird as that sounds, right? And so with that, though, we just had, going back to Elisha, what does that have to do with Elisha, right? God, the whole God Grim Reaper analogy thing again. Yes, every time I get to mention that, it always brings a little bit of joy in my life. But anyway, we just had the water miracle, which, as I mentioned, is kind of a way of validating that, like, Elisha, shares, if you will, in the power over life, if, as extreme and weird as that sounds. But by extension, since this is, God after all we're dealing with, then God also extends to Elisha the power over death. Because once again, if God is also the giver of life, he's also obviously the taker of life. Okay, cat, here you go. Anyway, And that is what this next story shows. Now, I know some people would kind of critique and say, well, it's kind of brutal that Elisha would do it this way, right? You know, a bunch of kids that seem, you know, they're not too nefarious. They're just kind of like little jackasses, you know, just being mean and calling him an old baldy, right? And telling him to go away. But and yeah, I know some people say, well, that's kind of petty for Elisha to like summon bears to kill them, right? But essentially, you know, Elisha does have that power over death as well. Is kind of the point of the story. And so, yeah, you could say that, like, well, Elisha could have been a lot more tactful. Maybe summon death to someone who deserves it more, right? And yeah, you could make that argument. I wouldn't argue against that. But at the same time, the point of the story is just to show, you know, the two stories going together, the restoring the water and the, you know, the bears mauling the kids, is fundamentally the idea that, you know, Elisha shares in this amount of power, if you will, from God, right? And essentially, you know, revealing more of God's nature, of him essentially being life and death, right? And so that's really the point of reading the two stories like that together. Really not much else. There's no other fancy trivia with chapter 2, so I think we're going to move on to chapter 3. I'm just going to eat a little more of this fruit that I have here. Eating on stream, so professional, right? I think I burned my mouth earlier today. It actually hurts a bit to eat this. But I suppose it can't be helped. Alrighty, let's move on to chapter 3. Oops. Chapter 3. Now Joram, the son of Ahab, became king of Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And he reigned 12 years. Now he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but did not as his father and mother had done. He got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which had caused Israel to commit. He did not turn away from those. Now Misha, king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to pay the king of Israel a tribute of 100,000 lambs. That's a lot of sheep. And the wool of 100,000 rams. But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So at that time, King Joram set out from Samaria and mobilized all Israel. He also sent his message to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go out with me to fight against Moab? And I will go with you, he replied. I am as you are, and my people are as your people, my horses as your horses. Excuse me. But what route shall we attack? Through the desert of Edom. So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. Now after a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them. What? Exclaimed the king of Israel. Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab? But Jehoshaphat asked, Is there no prophet of the Lord here, through whom we may inquire of the Lord? An officer of the king of Israel answered, Elijah, the son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. So Jehoshaphat said, The word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. Now Elisha said to the king of Israel, "Why do you want to involve me? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." "No," the king of Israel answered, "because it was the Lord who called us 3 kings together to deliver us into the hands of Moab." And Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I do not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not pay any attention to you. But now bring me a harpist." So while the harpist was playing, the hand of the Lord came on Elisha and said, "This is what the Lord says. I will fill this valley with pools of water. For this is what the Lord says. You will neither see wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water. And you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord, and he will deliver Moab into your hands. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones." So the next morning, about the time for the offering of the sacrifice, there it was, water flowing from the direction of Edom, and the land was filled with water. Now all the Moabites had heard that the kings had come to fight against them. Hang on, I'll just move this thing a bit. Okay. Where was I? Let's just go back to verse 21. I'll just read that part again. Now all the Moabites had heard that the kings had come to fight against them. So every man, young and old, who could bear arms was called up and stationed on the border. When they got up early in the morning, the sun was shining on the water. To the Moabites across the way, the water looked red, like blood. "That's blood," they said. "Those kings must have fought and slaughtered each other. Now to the plunder, Moab!" But when the Moabites came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and fought them until they fled. And the Israelites invaded the land and slaughtered the Moabites. They destroyed their towns, and each man threw a stone on every good field until it was covered. They stopped up all the springs and cut down every good tree. Only Kir Hareseth was left with its stones in place. But men armed with slings surrounded it and attacked it. When the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom. But they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land. And that's chapter 3. So chapter 3 was not as long. Or at least it didn't feel that way. So what happens here in chapter 3? So basically, we have these kings going out to go fight, because apparently that's what they do. And they're going to go fight the Moabites. Now at this point, I mean, we don't really know what's going on with the Moabites. They're just kind of still there. You would think that they had been already wiped out like the Philistines and other groups like that. But no, the Moabites were still around. And so now there's this whole thing of like, okay, we should probably just go fight the Moabites because there's really no one else to fight right now. And so first, these guys start going around, they walk around in circles, and they run out of water. which is just oof, unfortunately. Because I mean, when you've been traveling for like a week without stopping anywhere or without plundering somebody or whatever, right? You're going to run low on your supplies. And of course, this ended up being advantageous for the Israelites. Because when God shows up on the scene by making this, I guess you could say, excuse me, I guess you say this magic pond of water that just kind of appears, quote unquote, flows from Edom. But basically, it's like a magic pond that appears, right? And that same pond ends up creating delusions for, the Moabites, who were probably not too far off. I'm so tired now. But basically, the Moabites get lulled into a trap, which I guess God set up. And then the Moabites get wasted, right? Oh, I'm feeling the tiredness now. But yeah, I mean, it's a good reason to keep the stream relatively light. Just read chapter 4, and then once we're done chapter 4, we'll be done the stream, right? It'll be a shorter one today, but that's okay. I did go a little longer on Mondays. And, you can always watch my other content too, so I don't mind today being a little shorter. Because I don't really have much else to say about chapter 3, right? Because chapter 3 just kind of tells you a series of events. Elisha being Elisha, just having real authority and power, right? Anything he says goes, basically. Because, the Spirit of God is strongly with him, if you will, right? And so, Elisha, he plays a very minor role at this point because he's just kind of there where the miracles are. And of course, that's why the kings go to him, right? Because they know that, like, where this guy is, the miracles are there. And they obviously take advantage of that, right? Which is one of those things that makes Jehoshaphat an interesting character, because he must be well aware, right? And maybe, he wasn't the best king, but he was definitely a better king. And that was because he was aware of, like, where the Spirit of the Lord is, right? Then there's, like, power. Oh, I'm just going to mute that for a second while I eat this fruit. Okay, the rushing water noise is gone. I'm going to move the camera back now. Hope you enjoyed the few seconds of looking at my cat just walking around on me. Anyway, let's put this thing back up. Okay. Not much else to say about chapter 3, though, so... But it's one of those funny things where, like, I guess God uses the same trap pretty frequently where, like, the enemies get confused and then they end up doing something really stupid. And then Israel's just like, awesome, we got idiot enemies, let's just take them out easily, right? I mean, that is the best way to beat somebody, and it definitely does, at the humiliation points, right? Where you can defeat your enemies because they were just plain stupid. But Israel gets to live another day. Alright, let's just finish off chapter 4 and then we'll be done reading stream today. Well, chapter 4 is going to be kind of long, though, I think. Yeah, it's pretty long. But I think it's also a good place to end, too. So, let's just finish off with chapter 4. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as a slave." And Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing here at all, except a small jar of olive oil." And then Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour oil into all the jars. And as each is filled, put it to one side." So she left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all of the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, I need a voice for this kid. I don't know why I can't do really good kid voices, I guess. "There's not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. So she went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." Now one day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there. Now she urged him to stay for a meal, so whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. And she said to her husband, I need a voice for this woman. A different one. I can't use the woman's voice. Okay, give me a sec here. So she said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put it in a bed and a table and a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." So one day when Elisha came and he went up to his room and lay down there, he said to his servant Gehazi, I didn't say you say that, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her and she stood before him. Now Elisha said to him, his servant, "Tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now, what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" She replied, "I have my own home among my people." "What can be done for her?" Elisha asked. So Gehazi said, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old." Then Elisha said, "Call her." So he called to her, and she stood in the doorway. "About this time next year," Elisha said, "you will have a son in your arms." "No, my lord," she objected. "Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about the same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. Now the child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. And he said to his father, "My head, my head." His father told the servant, "Carry him to his mother." So after the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. So she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return." "Why go to him today?" he asked. "It's not the new moon or the Sabbath." "That's all right," she said. So she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So when Elisha saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, there's a Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?'" "Everything is all right," she said. When she reached the man of God on the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone. She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why." "Did I ask you for a son, my lord?" she said. "Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Elisha said to Gehazi, "Tuck your cloak into your belt and take my staff in your hand and run. Don't greet anyone you meet, and if anyone greets you, don't answer. Then lay my staff on the boy's face." But the child's mother said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So he got up and he followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him, "The boy is not awakened." When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and laid on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, as he stretched himself on him. The boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out on him once again. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." And he did. When she came, he said, "Take your son." She came in and fell at his feet and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. Verse 38. Now Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in that region. And while the company of the prophets were meeting with him, he said to his servant, "Put on the large pot and cook some stew for these prophets." And one of them went out into the fields to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and picked as many of its gourds as his garments could hold. When he returned, he cut them up into the pot of stew, though no one knew what they were. The stew was poured out for the men, but as they began to eat, they cried out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot!" And they could not eat it. Then Elisha said, "Get some flour." He put it in the pot and said, "Serve it to the people to eat." and there was nothing harmful in the pot. Now a man came from how the hell do you say that? Salisha. That's how you say that. A man came from Baal Salisha, bringing the man of God 20 loaves of barley baked bread from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of new grain. Give it to the people, Elisha said. How could I set this before 100 men? His servant asked. But Elisha answered, Give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and have some left over. Then he sent it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. Okay, so that's chapter 4. And now that second wind's coming, so now I'm not like yawning and stuff. Although I can see that changing pretty soon. So let's try and get this thing done before I end up yawning more and being tired. Okay, so chapter 4. This is a weird chapter. There's a lot of stuff in it, so we got a lot of ground to cover. So, first we have this one story of this poor woman, and basically she has these 2 sons, and apparently a debt collector has come and is like, yo, you don't pay up, I'm going to take your sons as slaves. And so this woman's kind of distraught, right? Because if she loses her sons, then she has no one to take care of her, and then basically, you're basically screwed at that point, right? So she's like, what do I do, right? And Elisha comes up with a weird answer, but miracle of God time, I guess you could say, and he has her just pour olive oil into jars. Just keep pouring. Don't stop. And she eventually has enough oil to what would have been 1 flask of oil, if you will. Now she had a whole bunch. And then with that whole bunch, it was like, okay, we're going to sell it for money. And boom, she had money. Enough to pay off her debt, apparently. As Elisha says, and you can use the extra for yourself. Which must be a pretty sweet deal, man. Imagine if, never have to go to the market sometimes. Because then, my cooking oil supply would not run out. That would be kind of nice. But I doubt that would happen. But, that definitely saved this woman's life and, a potential future of isolation and probably death. So, that miracle occurs. And then, well, before that, I guess there's really not much else to say about the last story. I mean, I think that's interesting to observe with these miracles in this chapter. And I guess I'll talk about it more at the end. But you gotta see there's actually a pattern with these miracles, right? That'll occur. So the first one we have here is the flask of oil that could, is what we're gonna call it. Where basically it acts like a magical cornucopia of olive oil, right? And then this woman has a whole lot of olive oil all of a sudden. So that's the first one. Then the second one is this there's this other woman, a Shunammite woman, apparently. And at first, she was very hospitable to Elisha every time he would come by this town. And so she had a place made for him, and Elisha's like, sweet, now I have like a free sleeping place, right? Free hotel, basically. And he asks the woman, well, how can I repay you? Right? What can we do to repay her? And then he basically asks her, well, what do you lack? Is there something you don't have? Right? Maybe I can give that to you. What do you not have? And she just tells him outright that, well, I don't have a son. And he goes, well, God will give you one in a year, right? And of course, I always bring up these jokes because, the Bible just begs for these jokes to happen, honestly. But, the woman even says her husband's old. So, how's she going to communicate to her old-ass husband that, yeah, we're going to have a kid in a year, right? Which I guess the old guy can be excited because he's gonna have sex after not having sex for a while, maybe. I mean, he's an old guy, so who knows? But you know, he's getting lucky tonight, kind of thing, right? So, um, that happened. But I guess the guy's not so old, right? He's not like elderly, because apparently this guy's still like capable of like working in a field as a reaper. So he's not like, I guess he's not super old, but he's not like a young chipper either, right? And then of course, of course, another way you could probably read the passage is that like maybe the woman uses the guy's age as an excuse, because once again, maybe they just don't know, but perhaps both of them suffer from fertility issues, right? It doesn't matter who, you can't really blame one or the other, but maybe there's just some kind of fertility issues. It's a thing that happens with couples, right? There are some couples that have that struggle, right? They can't have kids easily for whatever reason, right? I mean, I know a couple people, they've tried to have kids, and no dice, right? And then but they also want to really be like, expand the family kind of thing. So more power to them that they've adopted like two. I think they plan to adopt a third kid, but that's besides the point. But they've adopted two kids, right? But the fact of the matter is, they're a couple that can have kids, right? Biologically themselves. And so, maybe that could have been the case with the Shunammite woman. We don't really know. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that they get a miracle baby, basically, right? And the miracle baby is the term of like when you have a couple that's been struggling for a while to have kids, and then they end up having one, despite all the past attempts, being failures, if you will. Then it finally happened, and that's probably what happened here. And so, of course, you run into another problem where like when they only have the one kid, they end up being overprotective, and that's kind of, you see a little bit of that in the story. But of course, once again, on the one hand, like I talked about the whole love risk game thing, where like you can't afford to be obsessive and overly possessive, right? And parents can fall guilty of this, and then you get to the other side of it where like obviously if like parents of an only child will become pretty possessive, right? Because an only child is kind of, quite literally, and you see this in the Shunammite woman's case, it's quite literally putting all your eggs in one basket, right? Because this kid is the only kid they have. He's their quote unquote only investment into the future that they have, right? If he goes, that's it, right? And of course, it's always one, the sad thing, how does the sad saying go? It goes like, the worst thing for a parent to do is to bury their own child, which is true, right? That is the worst thing any parent can go through, is to bury a child. But and that's a legitimate fear that this woman has here, right? When their son, he has this headache that apparently he dies from it, and then she goes to go grab Elisha, and then of course the kid's still lying in this bed. So God knows how long it's been, right? Has the body started smelling yet? And so then that's its own crazy thing right there, right? If the body started smelling like Lordy, like Elisha locks himself in with this dead body, and then the weird resurrection ritual, if you want to call it that, right, occurs where like Elisha just puts himself completely over this kid, right? It's just it is a weird thing to read, and there's no way around that. You can't. You can't find a person who wouldn't say this is a weird scene, right? Where Elisha just like plops himself right over this kid, and then like just prays and breathes into him continuously. He gets up, does it a second time, and then the kid like sneezes a bunch of times and then wakes up. Like it's just bizarre, and it doesn't matter who you are when you're reading this. It's just weird. But hey, all stories and mythologies have their own weird moments. So I mean, reviving a kid from the dead by lying on top of him and praying, like, okay, that's weird, but I'm sure like other stories have come up with weirder stuff. So like, yeah, Bible's got your dose of weirdness for the week, I guess you could say. At least in Second Kings chapter 4, right? There's your uh, weird dosage of the week, and it is a weird moment. Not much else to say about that chapter, at least not until I cover the last thing that happens in this chapter. Well, a couple things in this chapter, I think. There's two more things. So the first one is this like pot of like really bad food, I guess you could say. It's just so bad that apparently the people thought they were gonna die from it. So we have some amateur like gatherer, I guess, and he gathers a whole bunch of these weird wild vines, I think. What does he end up picking up? He ends up picking like, yeah, a bunch of wild vines, or a bunch of gourds from a wild vine is what it says. I mean, God knows what he's picking, really, right? Whatever it is, it ain't good, right? And so he like puts it in the stew pot, and then it ends up like everybody's like, "Oh God, this is like the like." I don't know whether it was like its taste or like as soon as they swallowed it, it might have made their throats burn. We don't know if like they were feeling queasy or nauseous. Don't know. The Bible doesn't really tell us. They just like freak out that this is like, what is this? It's like death in a pot, which is gonna be the best way to describe something terrible, right? That's the best way you could describe like terrible food. Is like this is death in a pot. And the people freak out, rightfully so, right? Because they don't know what they're eating now. I mean, if you were eating something that you didn't know what it was, right, you might freak out too. Especially if it tasted bad. You would definitely freak out. And so the people are freaking out, rationally so. And then Elisha's just like, let's just put flour in it, and for some reason it works. So maybe like, I don't know, the gourds are probably like a weird herb, like overly spicy or something like that. Like once again, the Bible is really pretty vague about what it is, and so how flour fixes the problem is, no one's really sure. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just get this thing out of here. And so, you know, how flour fixes this death in a pot thing, not very well explained. I don't think the Bible really cared to explain it. I'm just gonna assume that like the gourds were like a weird spice or something, and then the flour just kind of like mellows it out well enough, and then they say, "Oh, now it's edible. We can just eat it now." So maybe that's what happened, right? But basically, a lot. I mean, this was one of those the pot one, the death in a pot story is not so much of a miracle, right? Like the last two stories, we had like a magical flask of oil that doesn't run out for like a while, and then we also had like raising a boy from the dead. Those are pretty big things, and then we have this weird like cooking mishap, right? That apparently has a simple solution. So it kind of seems underwhelming when you read that part, but whatever. You do you, I guess. Second Kings. Let me get the last part of chapter 4, and there's this part where what's going on here? Let me just go over it briefly because I kind of brain farted on what it is. Okay, so basically, some guy delivers like what 20 loaves of barley bread baked from the grain, and then they're like, "Oh, how are we possibly going to feed 100 guys with only 20 loaves of bread?" Because the implication is like, we're not talking about like, a loaf of Wonder Bread you get at the supermarket. We're talking about like when they say a loaf of bread, it's like one of those like, a giant, like a baguette from like a French bakery kind of thing, right? Like you don't expect a baguette to feed like, you don't expect a baguette to feed like a whole bunch of people. Usually one baguette per person, right? A baguette goes to, a person can eat a whole baguette pretty easily, right? That's when we talk about these loaves of bread, when the Bible brings it up, you have to think more like that, right? You can't think of like a large loaf of bread from like the supermarket. Even though the word loaf is used, treat it more like a baguette in like a bakery or something. So with that being said, 20 loaves of bread would be, would feed 20 people, you probably think, right? There might be that one eating machine that's going to eat like 2 of them, right? Or 3 of them even. But you don't think 20 loaves of bread is going to feed more than 20 guys, right? And here Elisha's just like, well, why don't we feed everyone that's here? And apparently there were 100 people. And of course the servant's just like, yeah, I don't see that happening, right? This 20 loaves of bread will barely feed 20 people. How are you gonna expect it to feed like 100? But we have a miracle happen, and Elisha manages to pull it off. That everybody gets more than enough, and apparently there's still leftover. Of course, the Bible doesn't really tell you how much leftover, so you can't say it could be like a little bit, but that's besides the point. The point is that basically something that would barely feed 20 people manages to feed 100 and then some, right? Of course, that miracle has a little bit of a parallel with like, Jesus's famous feeding of the quote unquote 5,000, but it's actually way more than that. Because of course in that passage, in the synop, and basically all the Gospels have it, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. It's actually way more than that, because the Bible will later correct itself, or not correct itself. That's the wrong way of putting it. When the Bible will say, well, the people that were fed were 5,000 men, but then of course it doesn't accommodate for all the women that were present, the children that were present, etc., etc. So actually the number of that is actually way bigger than 5,000 people, which only makes the miracle more ridiculous. But there's obviously parallels between that miracle and Elisha's miracle of feeding 100 guys with like 20 baguettes, basically. And so we have 4 miracles here. Well, 4 miracles. One of them is kind of hard to really take it as a miracle. The flour and the pot of death. One. That one seems like that one could have been solved a lot easier, whereas the other ones all seem like more like miracles. I mean, the raising the boy from the dead is definitely up there, right? Now, of course, as I mentioned, there is obviously a parallel with like the Jesus feeding the 5,000 plus, with the food thingy. But of course, Elisha's miracles here clearly mimic that of Elijah's, back in 1 Kings. And of course, Elijah had, when Elijah met the one woman and her son, and, she was based in that story, the Elijah version of the story. The woman's like, we have only enough for the 2 of us, and we'll just eat that and we'll die after, because then we'll have nothing left, right? So in a similar way, here's a woman who has basically really nothing, right? And she's basically on the brink of death, though her sons are probably going to survive because they'll be taken as someone else's slaves. But she's basically like on the brink of death. And so there's that interesting bit there where the Elijah and Elisha story parallel here. And of course, they both have the same kind of miracle happen, right? Where in the first woman's case, she has more than enough. Her flour and her flask of oil become magical, and that they don't run out until the famine ends. Right? In the Elisha version of the story here in 2 Kings, the woman's flask of oil doesn't run out until she can make more than enough money with it. So there's a parallel between Elijah and Elisha here. Then we have the resurrection story, right? Where Elijah resurrects the son of the woman that he already helped. Here in Elisha's story, it's a completely different woman. And of course, the Bible points this out by referring to her as the Shunammite woman, right? So Elisha is clearly in a different place, right, than where he was in the other story, and it's not the same woman in the Elijah story. So it's a very different scenario here. It's a very different scenario, and we have a dead boy that apparently is going to get brought back from the dead. So Elisha shows up onto the scene. I love this whole like putting the staff on the kid's face. So I'm just gonna put a stick over somebody. Okay, like I don't know how that would work, but just picturing it in my head of like some kid lying dead in a bed and guy walks in and just puts a stick over his face, right? Obviously there's like spiritual significance of that and mythology tropes, right? Of, you know, being brought back into nature, right? Without burying them. And so the stick, putting the stick over the kid's face would be like, you know, being in touch with nature again, right? Because, you know, a walking stick traditionally made out of wood. And so the reconnection with nature. And then, of course, to by the child being reconnected with nature, then he would grow much like, you know, a plant from nature, right? But then, of course, the natural way doesn't work, and then, you know, the supernatural, ridiculous scene happens where like Elisha sprawls himself over this kid and just like prays and breathes all over him, and then the kid revives, right? I mean, Elijah, sorry, in First Kings did the same thing. He like sprawled himself over, you know, a dead boy, and then like as he prayed and, you know, breathed. And of course, you know, I mentioned this on Monday's stream as well. And of course, you know, the Genesis story, right, where, you know, God breathes life, and so, you know, there's this connection with like the men of God, I guess, in Elijah and Elisha, the men of God being closely associated because they're the main prophets. They get this privilege of being closely associated with God himself. And so by them breathing, you know, no homo, into, you know, mouth to mouth into these, you know, boys, right, is the whole emulation of God breathing life into Adam and by extension human beings, right? And so there's that correlation with them being associated with God breathing life into another human being. And that's how both of them, you know, raised two different boys from the dead, right? So there's that parallel with this miracle. Now the pot of death one, I couldn't really put a parallel in this one of like what else does it compare to with like Elijah. So this chapter, Elisha does these 4 miracles, and they obviously have like some parallels with Elijah. The first 2 being pretty obvious. The pot of death one, this is why I like this one. This one's kind of a weird part of the story because I'm like, what does this one got to do with the other ones? It's not as clear cut. Whereas the 20 loaves of bread and the 100 people, it's parallel to how, you know, when Elijah returns to Israel, and then of course, you know, the whole Baal versus God, fire from the sky thing, and then rain comes and then the people are able to eat again because the crops are growing and all that, right? There's hope for the land. You know, that's what happens with, you know, and this with the bread story, right? And of course, you know, in Second Kings 4, there's this point about how like this is bread from like the first part of the harvest, right? And so, you know, you think of like the Elijah story and how, you know, it's not like food magically grew as soon as it started raining, right? Like obviously the people still needed to wait, you know, for crops to grow and stuff. Just because it's raining again doesn't mean everything's perfect, right? Everything is good enough. But with the Elisha story, it points out that like this is the first fruit of the grain, and so, you know, not everything that has grown out, so you don't really have your proper crop yet. But yet the people are like, we've got to eat, and now but because we got to eat, and we're eating, you know, at the first crop, right? We still don't have enough. But at the same time, Elisha, you know, he says, well, no, there is enough, right? Just give it to the people, and then the bread, God will do the rest, make some magic bread out of it, and then now there's more than enough, and then some, right? And so there's an interesting kind of parallel there in that story between Elijah and Elisha. But of course, with Elisha, now we start moving forward, right? We're not just looking back like the first two miracles do, but the second two miracles kind of look forward, right? And so that's just an interesting thing to point out in chapter 4 and these miracles that Elisha does. Of course, the funny thing is now, even though Elisha is kind of like this big deal, quote unquote, the Bible doesn't really, the Bible will bring him up here and there, and some cool stuff will happen, but for the most part, yeah, Elisha doesn't actually do all that much. But I guess the point of these miracles too, from a strictly just reading the book of Kings perspective, is just to say that yeah, he's Elisha's the real deal. And we'll see more as we go along, that he does have this double portion of the Spirit, right? Does that mean his magical powers are double the level? What does that even mean, right? So the Bible is obviously pretty vague on that, but we do see that Elisha will have more crazy miracles under his belt, right? To kind of show that he does have a greater portion, quote unquote, of God's Spirit on him than Elijah did. And chapter 4 kind of paints a pretty interesting, introduction to that, if you will. Not like Elijah hasn't already, or sorry, not that Elisha hasn't done a couple cool things already, right? Back with the, healing water in this one town and summoning bears to go kill a bunch of people. So, not that already is crazy miracles already, but chapter 4 just gives you a whole bunch to validate, if you will, that yeah, Elisha's the real deal. Okay, so that's all I have to really say about chapter 4. Anything else? Not really. Did my notes say anything? Not really. So, I think that is a good place to stop. 4 chapters is quite a lot. We did cover quite a bit of material. We've been going for an hour and 40 minutes. So, I think this is a good place to end our reading stream for today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we end it officially. Not much to say. Monday we'll have our next streaming Parson podcast. And then that will be at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Thursday, we'll have some throwback Thursday of Heroes of Might and Magic 2. The Price of Loyalty. And then next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time, we will continue on with 2nd Kings. And yeah, we're going to move through Kings pretty quickly because I know 2nd Kings isn't that long. It's 20, not even, it's about 20 chapters as well. It's 19 chapters. Something like that, right? Book of 2nd Kings isn't that long, right? We cover 4, if we cover 4-ish about every week, right? We'll cover the entirety of the Book of Kings in 4 more weeks, right? Because obviously including today's. Or not including today's, because we're basically at the end of today's. We'll have 4 more streams of the Book of Kings. And we'll be done the Book of Kings, right? And we'll be well into November at that point. So, that's how things are looking for next week. Nothing out of the ordinary. I am thinking of doing a Halloween stream. But then I also realized it's on a Sunday, and that sucks. So we'll see. I might do something on the 27th. I'm thinking about it. I haven't confirmed it. I'll let you know on Monday if we're going to do a Halloween related stream on the 27th. Because I'm not going to do it on the 31st. For several reasons. The first reason is because I have to work pretty long on Sundays. And then usually on Sundays, my buddy Baruka, the Toasty Baruka is now what he goes by. He streams and I'll usually help him out with that. We're probably going to do something on Halloween Day with him. So that's one reason not to do a Halloween video on my own channel. That's one reason. Another reason would be that I don't want to be doing stream stuff and then have to, there's all the things that you think it might happen, it probably won't happen, but at the same time, you don't want to be caught with your pants down, kind of thing, right? Where, that was a poor choice of words, though. When I think about what I have to say next, where basically, you never know, there might be trick or treaters. Haha. You never know, there might be trick or treaters, even though like I doubt it nowadays. Like last year, there was none because of the whole COVID thing, right? And there's still like, yeah, sure, a lot of people are getting vaccinated and stuff like that now, but you don't know if people are gonna still be like confident enough to go trick or treating, right? So on the one hand, I don't think there's gonna be any trick or treaters, but on the other hand, I don't want to stream on the possibility that like there are trick or treaters, because then I have to answer the door every time, right? So that would just get in the way of doing a Halloween stream like that. So we'll see. We'll see if I do something on the 27th. It would be nice to do something for Halloween on the 27th. Don't forget to check out the attempt at a Halloween stream, that I already posted. That was Monday's stream, so don't forget to check that out. That is a thrill of a time. And yeah, that's basically it for housekeeping. And then after next week, we'll be into November. Can you already believe it's going to be November really soon? Like, lordy. Like, 2021 is almost over. You think about it like that, like, damn, right? Like, that's gnarly. Anyway, that's enough of that, though. So, yeah, just to say it again, Monday, podcast, 4 o'clock Pacific time. Next Thursday, we got more Throwback Thursday episodes of Heroes Might Magic 2. I am playing the last map of the Descendants campaign, the Epic Battle. And then, of course, next Friday at 3 o'clock, we will continue our Bible reading streams, continuing through 2nd Kings. We'll see if I do a Wednesday stream. We'll see. For Halloween. It might be a fun idea. But anyway, with that said, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. Hope you guys have a good weekend. And I will see you guys on Monday for the Streaming Parson podcast. Or, if you're only here for the Bible reading, you come back next Friday. So I hope to see you guys later. God bless you, and good night.